Hey guys, so tonight we are picking back up in lesson 10 of our series here on SR4 titled Satan's World System. And so we have been in the section on the vanity of life here for a while, and we're picking back up after several weeks of hiatus for me. I was getting some practical stuff done on video organization and things like that, but tonight we're resuming our study here, and the topic of today is going to be how unbelievers chase after myth happiness to blind themselves to mortality. So the last lesson and Q&A we had done, lesson 9, was about how unbelievers, in rejecting the truth, find themselves with this void in their heart that must be filled with something. So just how nature abhors a vacuum, so too does that throne in our heart. And so something will always take God's place. And what we said at the very end of that lesson was the substitute that most readily tries to fill the void is the pursuit of happiness. So I suppose we should clarify and make sure we're talking about material happiness here, right? So material, physical, pursuit of possessions and security in this world, that is the thing that most readily tries to fill the void that is present in the hearts of man whenever man turns his back on God. So that was the lesson video. And then in the Q&A video last week, we had been talking about all of the things that unbelievers may try to do to fill this void in their hearts, aside from the pursuit of happiness. And so a lot of what we had talked about then wasn't so much this pursuit of happiness, which is going to be kind of the topic of discussion here for the next several lessons we do. This idea of myth happiness and the futility of chasing after it in this world, contrasting it with all the meaning we have in our spiritual activities as Christians. Well, what we talked about here was really more about some of the things that people do to fill their time that's not even chasing after this somehow ever present, not ever present, somehow ever future state of bliss that kind of characterizes the pursuit of happiness here that many people have, right? It's always kind of just out of reach. If only I work a little harder, if only I save a little more, then I'll be happy. Well, that sort of thing, like we argued then, has at least the ring of worthiness to it. You can see why people would want this. You can see why it would prove to be valuable were it actually possible to attain. But what we kind of talked about in the Q&A video there were all the things that people spend their time on that don't even measure up to that. So these things that are sort of self-evidently pointless, self-evidently worthless, and yet nonetheless, we humans find ourselves wasting time in them. And so kind of bleak here in what we talked about. We kind of closed there, making the point that we need to make sure that we aren't hypocritical, that we don't fall into legalism here, that we apply the same standard to ourselves in how we spend our time. But all of this was kind of leading up to the discussion that we're going to be having on the unbeliever's pursuit of myth happiness. And so we had talked about all of the meaning that the lives of believers have. And so I think even a couple lessons back before this one, we were talking primarily about the relationship that we ought to have to wealth and material possessions. And we talked about how everything we have is given by the hand of God, resources for us to use here in our time on earth. And so we shouldn't get too bent out of shape if we lose it because they're not our possessions to begin with. And so we had done a great contrast between the materialistic worldview that unbelievers have and everything that we have as resources for us as Christians in our spiritual walk. And so everything was kind of leading up here to this point that after going over what it is that we should be about as Christians and our perspective in relation to suffering, that is that suffering is actually more the norm for us than the exception here. Well, we are leading up to kind of the counterbalancing point. So if we talked about what believers should be about, well, then we're going to talk about the primary thing that unbelievers do. So this is going to hopefully present sort of the most common alternative to Christianity properly applied that people follow in this world. So people who are Christians have the spiritual approach, and the most common approach to that is what we're going to be going over here as we discuss myth happiness for the next little bit. But this week, specifically to pull us back on topic here, this week we're going to be talking about why people chase after myth happiness. What is their purpose in it? They may not be able to tell you directly that this is why they're doing it, but in their hearts, this is the reason, is because chasing after this myth happiness, chasing after comfort and security and pleasure in this world numbs people to their own mortality. It numbs people to the approach of death. And so as we'll see, This is why unbelievers pursue happiness. This is the purpose of their pursuit. Why people spend their lives chasing after this is because it lets them live as if they will never die. So here's the outline, the things that we're going to go over this week here. So we're going to start by talking about how, ironically, the unbeliever's focus on obtaining happiness makes it completely out of their reach. Then we're going to move into how, even despite this, this only serves to stoke the futile pursuit of myth happiness even further. So rather than dampening people's enthusiasm for it, it makes them desire it all the more. And then after this, we're going to get into sort of the meat and potatoes. The main point we're making today in all this is that unbelievers pursue happiness primarily because it lets them forget about mortality. So whether or not they would say that with their lips, that is the reality of the situation here. And the consequence of this situation of pursuing happiness to sort of stick your head in the sand about your own impending death is that, well, people live a lie because of this. They constantly delude themselves. They constantly ignore the existential realities around them, and it leads to them living a life that is essentially a lie. And all of this we will close out with here today with this idea that it may seem kind of strange for us that so many people engage in this behavior, but on balance, it's really not all that surprising given the bleakness of the situation that unbelievers face. So, in a life without God, in a life without spiritual hope, ignoring reality is a far more preferential choice to being crushed by it. And so that's why many people engage in this sort of behavior here. So, this is the outline, and hopefully by the end of today, we'll kind of make it clear why this is the default position that people take aside from the spiritual path, why people chase after myth happiness in this world. All right, so the first point here, the idea that ironically, the unbeliever's focus on obtaining happiness makes it completely out of their reach. And so the basic idea here is that in searching for pseudo happiness, so in the material and the physical, seeking security here in this physical world rather than in spiritual ends, well, people, in as much as they reject God in doing this, they sort of doom themselves to making their lives pointless because life really is pointless and futile if you don't have the spiritual, if you are not following God. And so you reject the sort of happiness that you get from spiritual ends, from doing that which God calls you to and serving in the body and everything like this. Well, when you reject God, you also reject this spiritual form of happiness, which leaves you without real recourse, without legitimate means of lasting happiness in this life. So the irony in this is that simply by trying to find their happiness external to God, unbelievers are setting themselves on an impossible path because there is no happiness external to God. And so this is somewhat along the lines of these verses. I quoted one and then said compare a whole bunch of others. This is very frequent in the Gospels here. This idea that he who has found his life will lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake will find it. It sounds very paradoxical here, but if people try to safeguard their life and their possessions in this life, their life and their possessions in this world, well, then rather than guaranteeing these things for them, despite all their effort, that only serves to make them lose it. Whereas the people who have their priorities straight and esteem God and spiritual matters more, will in so laying down their life of their choice, God will give them ever so much more. And that sort of paradox here is kind of what we're getting at, is that it's the very act of rejecting God that dooms unbelievers to a life where they can never truly be satisfied, where they can never truly grasp hold of the happiness that's always outside of their grasp, because true spiritual happiness only comes by following God. And so even with this being the case, this only serves to stoke the pursuit of happiness even further. This guaranteed futility only serves to intensify the unbeliever's struggle to achieve happiness and security in this ephemeral life. So you'd think that maybe it would cause people to sit down and think a little bit and wonder why, no matter how hard they strive, they never seem to actually be fulfilled or satisfied. But instead, people decide to struggle all the harder, thinking that if I just try a little harder, if I wait a little more, then I will find this myth happiness that I'm seeking here. And of course, they don't call it myth happiness. That's our word for it. This happiness that is chased after, like the myth of El Dorado, right? Something that people want as some sort of treasure or something to set their dreams and their goals and their aspirations on, but it's not actually attainable. That's why we call it myth happiness here. But I mean, you won't hear unbelievers using this term because it is somewhat of a derogatory term. It's not supposed to be a positive thing because we're showing that it's simply not attainable. It's not a realistic standard that people can actually grasp hold of in this life. So in this idea of unbelievers struggling all the harder to achieve these things, we have this verse here from Matthew chapter 6, which is part of the passage in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus exhorts us not to worry as Christians. But here we say that Gentiles eagerly seek all these things. So not only do they seek them, not only do they strive to provide them for themselves materially, this verse says that they eagerly seek them, right? People are zealous about their pursuit of things here in the material world. And so the thought here might go that if only they can achieve their happiness, maybe all of the troublesome existential realities they are ignoring will go away, right? So this is the sort of ostrich-like behavior that we're going to turn to next here, that maybe if they can achieve their happiness in this physical world, maybe they can successfully ignore all the things that they're ignoring. Maybe it will all just work out somehow. And so this right here is exactly why unbelievers pursue this happiness, this myth happiness that we're talking about, because it lets them forget about mortality and the ever approaching death that awaits all mankind. So there is actually a form of twisted logic in the vain pursuit of temporal security and pseudo happiness, these things that characterize the unbelieving lifestyle. And that main reason here is that all the effort and striving involved in attempting to achieve these two illusory objectives do serve to cloud the issue of mortality. So they are a very, very effective distraction to the impending approach of death that faces every human being alive. And the reason why this is such a desirable thing for unbelievers is because death is very uncomfortable for any unbeliever to inspect too closely or too often. And one exception to this is given here in this section of the study later that talks about all of the lies about death, which the devil has spread. We won't cover that here, but just a note, a sneak preview for later on in the study. So, you know, in absent from people having fundamental misunderstandings about death, so if they aren't deluding themselves about it in some other way, well, people will tend to not think about it as much as possible. And that's because thinking about it, especially thinking about it hard and specifically, is very uncomfortable because they don't have the hope of an eternal future like we do as Christians. So this is what we're saying here. People don't do this because it's so harsh, because it's so uncomfortable. It's just too much for most people to take. And so even though such introspection is justified by the circumstances of life for all those who have not found resolution in Christ, so for people who don't believe and have their future safeguarded by said belief, well, even though such introspection is justified by that, it's simply too uncomfortable for most people to spend their time on. And so it is that although our extremely limited lifespan and the exceptionally fragile nature of our existence is without a doubt the most pressing concern for any given individual, it is largely and foolishly ignored. And this is true of the vast majority of the unbelieving world, who simply ignores death and pretends like it won't apply to them, even though it is destined to apply to all. So even though they ignore it, death makes a mockery of all that for which the unbeliever strives. So what good are achievements? What good is wealth if in a few short days or months or years, death rips you away from them? So even if you assume a stable world, which we've kind of already talked about before in this series, you can't necessarily safeguard anything in this world. Well, even if you assume a stable world, nothing can last because we don't last as humans. We are temporary and finite, here today and gone tomorrow, like a dust in the wind. And so for this reason, because we don't last, death makes a mockery of all human achievement, like we've already said before and will continue to say in the future here. And so again, in irony here, this very rush for wealth and fame and glory and pleasure and possessions and everything else that unbelievers strive after, well, this very rush after these things clouds in their minds the fact that these things are pointless. So in pursuing them, they lose sight of the fact that even gaining these things will not give them satisfaction. So the very chasing after of them obscures the true nature of these things. And that is the sad irony here. Because, as we just said, down to a person, no one gets out alive. We will all face death in this life. We will all return to dust in the blink of an eye. So for this reason, the godless pursuit of pseudo-happiness and false security can never actually take the sting out of death. But as the main point we've been making here, what it can do for those who are manically involved in it is provide a distraction, right? Provide a distraction from the distinctly unpleasant reality of death's inexorable approach. So even though not a single person can control when they die or lengthen their years against the will of heaven, well, even though all of that is out of our control, if people chase after these things like this, they won't always have to be thinking about it. It won't always be invading their conscious mind and destroying any peace they might have in this life. So this is why unbelievers pursue happiness, because it lets them forget about mortality. Now, you might say, why don't we just let unbelievers live like this? If they're going to reject the truth, is it really so bad? Well, the problem with this is that it's more than just ignoring the truth. It's actually believing the exact opposite thing here. Because the unbeliever, although mortal, as we've just covered, behaves as if he were immortal. And that right there is the essence of his folly. So he stores up wealth as if he will be around to enjoy it forever. He seeks glory, fame, and achievement as if it will not fade with his impending demise. He indulges himself in all pleasures as if the grave will not put his enjoyment of them to an end. So in short, the reason why we might weigh in so heavily against this in the lives of unbelievers is because the more they buy into this lie, the more vain and futile their life really is. Because in chasing after all these things, in deluding themselves into thinking that these are the things that we should be pursuing as humans in this world, they doom themselves to losing ever more in their pursuit here, even more than they would if they were to just live quiet and humble lives, enjoying their work and their family and the food put before them without seeking after ever more. So it's this vain pursuit, the madcap rush here, that, to use Dr. Luganville's terminology, right, this maniacal pursuit of these things that increases the vanity and futility to an unbearable degree. That is what we are arguing primarily against. But nonetheless, no matter the degree to which people strive after these things, is the rejection of God that ultimately sets people down this path. But the more people buy into the lie, the more futile their lives become, the more they'll be shot through with this sad irony that we've been talking about, because people become blinded to the reality of the situation. Because in chasing these things, they become incapable of seeing that these things themselves cannot satisfy. So that's the consequence of this delusion here, right? Is living a lie, living as if you were immortal, even though you are most certainly not. Now, to close out this week, we've now talked about the main reason why unbelievers choose this, why they pursue happiness, right? Even as we've said, even if they wouldn't confess as such with their lips, well, this is the underlying reason why people try to distract themselves with the physical and the material here in this world. And then we've talked briefly here about the consequences of giving yourself over to this, of diving into the delusion rather than keeping it at arm's length and not pursuing it to such a high degree. Well, the last point that we're going to make here today is that this situation, bleak as it is not really all that surprising, given the bleakness and the grimness of the situation that unbelievers face. So the unbeliever has every reason to fear death, more so than he may know, right? Even if not consciously aware of the eternal fate that awaits them after death, unbelievers have much more reason to fear it than we do as Christians. For us as believers, death is actually more or less a positive thing. We get taken out of this world of suffering and pain and tears into the presence of our God and our brothers and sisters forever. So death for us is not necessarily something to fear, but for the unbeliever, they have every reason to fear death. And for that reason, because for them, death is the end, something to be feared. Well, it's not that surprising, therefore, to find the unbeliever engaged in a frantic cycle of activity, accepting any and all substitute to blind his eyes to the reality of death's grim approach. Because if death will rob his life of all meaning and all purpose, everything he ever strived and gained for. And if death is completely unavoidable, if you combine those things and you actually think on that seriously, the only logical conclusion to this is depression, right? The crushing realization that life is completely pointless, that nothing you can do matters. That is the only conclusion you have if you actually hold these things in your mind as they are. And so because that is so uncomfortable, because unbelievers don't want to do that, it is not at all surprising to find them engaged in everything they can possibly do to not keep these things in their minds, to pretend that things are not so, to find some alternative to chase after, so that they are not crushed by the dawning realization of their own mortality, of the fact that death will rob everything they ever did of all meaning and purpose. So for this reason, that's why we really shouldn't be surprised by this behavior of sticking their heads in the sand and pretending that things are not so, because it's their only self-defense mechanism against the grimness of the fate that actually truly awaits them. So pretty dark, huh? But to recap here, this is our discussion of the primary reasons why unbelievers chase myth happiness. Now we'll get into more specifics on myth happiness as we keep going here. So what it is in more detail and why it's so vain and futile to pursue, why it can't last, things like that. So we'll talk about myth happiness itself in a little more depth. But today was mostly talking about why unbelievers might choose to pursue this, specifically in terms of attempting to forget their own mortality and pretend as if they won't die. So we started out by talking about the irony here that the unbelievers' focus on obtaining happiness in this physical and material world makes it completely out of their reach because they reject the spiritual, which is the only thing that can truly provide lasting satisfaction. But even so, nevertheless, this only serves to stoke the futile pursuit of myth happiness even further. And so in all of this, unbelievers do this because it lets them forget about mortality. Because chasing after these things makes it possible for them to not be crushed by the dawning realization of their impending death. And so the consequence of this delusion, as we made the point, the more that people believe this, the more that they buy into this pursuit of happiness and security here in this world, well, the more futile their lives will end up being, because their very pursuit of these things makes it impossible for them to see that these things themselves are completely pointless and vain. So the consequence of buying into this delusion is living a lie. And then as we closed on here, this behavior that we see here isn't really all that surprising given the grim reality that unbelievers face. So given that their entire lives lived without spiritual meaning or purpose are objectively futile and vain, right? Everything under here, everything under the sun is shot through with futility, like we've said in the past, and we'll continue to make the point here in this section on the vanity of life. Well, given that that's the only reality that the unbeliever has because they reject God, so as to not be crushed by that, that is why they stick their heads in the sand, why they turn their attention elsewhere and buy into this delusion, is to avoid the existential turmoil that comes from seeing things how they really are. And so for that reason, it's really not surprising to find people willingly pretending that reality is operating in a way in which it truly doesn't, because that behavior is a form of self-defense in a way for people to not find themselves crushed by the reality of their situation, were they actually to look at things objectively. So as I say, in coming lessons here, we will continue to be discussing this idea of myth happiness in more depth, and we'll pick up on various facets of it then. So stay tuned for that.